Hello, I'm Jeffrey Williams. Welcome to another installment of Too Late for the Gods. Today we'll look at a video on the apologist Mike Winger's channel, which is linked below, titled How Free Will Conflicts with Atheism, which is a presentation of an argument set forth by his guest, a Dr. Tim Stratton. The intent of Stratton's argument is to demonstrate that humans have free will, that this free will can only be explained by way of the supernatural, and therefore free will proves the existence of God, and specifically the Christian God. The Winger video is long, repetitious, and rambling, but we can get a sufficient understanding of the argument by focusing on two shorter segments. At the beginning, Stratton gives a somewhat meandering outline of the assumptions and elements of his argument, so we will begin there as an overview. He then moves on to a detailed presentation of his argument, which we will examine more closely. Here's the introductory statement, which I'll pause a few times to comment.
Well, let's just start out by talking about naturalism. Naturalism is the view that only nature exists. So if that's the case, there's no God, there's no angels or demons, there's no abstract objects, and there's definitely not a human soul, an immaterial aspect of human existence. Right? If naturalism is true, only the stuff that scientists could test or possibly discover is what actually exists. But if nature is all that exists, then that means that everything about humanity, everything about you, would be caused and determined by the forces and past events of nature, like physics and chemistry, for example. But if physics and chemistry are running the entire show, then that means that physics and chemistry cause and determine everything about you. But if that's the case, then that means that physics and chemistry always causes and determines exactly what you think of and about and exactly how you think of and about it. But if that's the case, then if the forces of nature cause and determine you to hold a false belief, then it would be impossible for you to reach a better belief, let alone the truth. But here's the deal. You can reach true beliefs. You can do it. I mean, does anybody really want to say that they can't reach true beliefs? I mean, that would mean that you reached the true belief that you cannot reach true beliefs. And that's just crazy talk.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, here's what we can conclude. Since you can reach better and true beliefs, right? You're not forced to hold false beliefs. Then it follows that not all of your beliefs are caused and determined by the forces and past events of nature, or really anything else for that matter. And that means that you really are a free thinker. You're a free thinker. So that means that you have free will, namely free will in the libertarian sense. And I'll explain that more later. But that means that you seem to be more than just nature. That is to say that there seems to be something supernatural, as it were, about humanity, something other than nature about you. And I contend the best explanation for this free thinking and supernatural ability is God, and more specifically, the biblical view of God. So that's a quick fly.
He starts with the constrained dichotomy of naturalism versus supernaturalism, with naturalism defined as only those things that science can test and discover. It's a bifurcation fallacy in that it omits other non-metaphysical and non-supernatural approaches, such as Heideggerian question of being and non-reductive physicalism, which accepts that physical reality cannot be completely known through scientific method due to our epistemological limits. In doing so, he obscures the real question at hand, the conflicting views of a deterministically causal universe versus indeterminacy. If the universe is causally deterministic, then there could be no free will. Indeterminacy, on the other hand, frees us from determinism at the most fundamental level, allowing for the possibility of free will. At its core, free will is not a question of substances, souls, or the supernatural, but merely the degrees of freedom inherent in the universe and the quantum nature of the mind. Through this move, Stratton replaces indeterminacy with supernaturalism to set up the false dichotomy of material nature versus an immaterial soul. From the assumption that free will cannot be explained with physical nature, he argues that free will has a supernatural origin, which proves the existence of God, and specifically the Christian God. In doing so, he claims that if naturalism is true, then everything is causally determined by physics and chemistry, seemingly unaware that chemistry is in fact a branch of physics. I may seem to be needlessly picky here, but it's an early indication of much more serious naivety to come. From this blurred misrepresentation of the core issue of determinism versus indeterminacy, he moves to the claim that if nature forces upon us a false belief, we have no way under naturalism to reach a better belief. Perhaps. However, I see no reason why nature experienced from another perspective might not produce more accuracy, but this misses the real point. It might still be that deterministic causality is true, and our inability to discern the truth is just the consequence we have to accept. His dismissal of this possibility as crazy talk is not a criticism to be taken seriously. But that leaves another problem in his presentation. It isn't clear why having a true belief is necessarily connected to free will. He seems to imply that our ability to reason is itself an act of free will, and that reason fully explains our choosing what to believe and how to decide. His confusion of epistemology with practical choice will become more problematic as we examine his argument in detail. He next addresses the problem of truth by merely claiming we can have true beliefs. This evades two very difficult issues. The first is that it would also be possible to have true beliefs forced on us through determinacy. More importantly, this is an early example of his confusion of what we can know with what we can choose that carries on throughout his argument. Instead of pondering these more fundamental issues, he resorts to the old and tired claim of self-refutation of science. How could naturalism claim there are no true beliefs if that claim is itself a claim of a true belief? First, it isn't accurate to say naturalism precludes true belief, which I will explain in detail later on. For the question of free will, this is an irrelevant question anyway, but his real goal is to discredit naturalism in order to insert a God of the gaps solution. He intends to reduce the refutation of free will to naturalism and then discredit naturalism with its supposed inability to claim true belief. The self-refutation claim, however, is simply wrong. It is possible for a rational system to notice its inability to adequately describe observations that defy reason, such as in quantum non-locality and superposition, or the fundamental contradictions among Newtonian physics, relativity, and quantum mechanics. But this false claim of self-refutation is almost a reflex among apologists to evade addressing these problems involved. He moves from the false premises to the false conclusion that since you can reach true beliefs, you are capable of beliefs that are not deterministically derived and therefore a free thinker. And since that isn't possible within mere nature, we have a supernatural element of free will derived from a supernatural soul. He then pretends to address the conflation of naturalist with atheist.
But just to be clear, all naturalists are atheists, but although the majority of atheists seem to be naturalists, one could be an atheist and still think that some immaterial or supernatural realities exist. They're very rare, few and far between, but they They
Here he merely preserves his concealment of the false choice of naturalism versus the supernatural by claiming that there are a few atheists who believe in the supernatural, concealing the larger number of atheist physicists and philosophers who would fall under the non-reductive physicalist category, that is, those who reject both the notion of anything beyond physical reality and the notion that reality can be fully understood within science, not because of anything supernatural, but due to our limited cognitive structure. Winger then moves to blur the picture even further.
exist,
and my takeaway on that is that it seems to me that the naturalists are saying there's no free will because they're naturalists, or because of their assumptions and their prior beliefs about no God and just scientifically testable things in the universe. And
he claims that naturalists derive their views from the presupposition that there is no God. The inverse is actually the case. They reject God because of their view of a deterministic universe ascendant since Bacon, which removes the explanatory need for God. In other words, as the gaps narrow, God loses explanatory power. Stratton now completes his sleight of hand.
All naturalists are atheists. Typically, throughout the rest of this talk, if I say the word atheism, I'm meaning a naturalist. So here's the rub. If your thoughts and intentions are always caused and determined by external factors, then something other than you always causally determines exactly what you think of and about and exactly how you think of and about it.
He states that when he says atheist, he means naturalist, thus allowing himself to slide into the false appearance that free will implies the supernatural God. His actual argument, however, centers on a question that can only be understood as determinism versus indeterminacy, and the only correct term in his argument would be naturalist, not atheist. In short, he is confusing the term or equivocating. Now let's turn to his formal argument. He starts with a preliminary argument to set up a premise to his main argument.
So premise one, if humans do not possess libertarian freedom, then humans do not possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. Premise two, humans do possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. Right, who's going to disagree with that one? So conclusion, therefore, humans possess libertarian freedom. So this short syllogism is eye-opening because it deductively concludes something that's been debated. It's been debated for centuries. So if this argument stands, and I believe it does, I think it's one of the most powerful metaphysical arguments I've ever seen.
Premise one assumes that rational inference is the mode of free will as the ability to choose. This is a highly questionable assumption that has been increasingly refuted the past couple centuries. We could, in fact, view rational decision-making as the opposite of freedom. Reason works mechanistically. A syllogism is a sort of machine that dictates a conclusion, thus eliminating choice. If we submit ourselves to reason, we surrender our free will to the dictates of the machine. Again, I'm not arguing we don't have free will. That's an open question. We just might. But it would never be demonstrated as our ability to reason. It was, in fact, the Enlightenment promotion of reason applied to sense data as the true path to knowledge that brought about the view of a causally deterministic universe to begin with. Premise 2 suffers from some vagueness intended to cover up some confusion. That we as humans have an innate capacity for reason in no way implies that reason necessarily affirms knowledge claims. If by affirming knowledge claims, Stratton means demonstration of a true correspondence between the thought and reality. Later, he will make clear that this is his meaning, which again is a naive assumption. I'll expand on this later in the video. The point here is his claim that these premises prove his conclusion of libertarian freedom simply is not valid. Reason is neither a simple matter of free choice, nor is it necessarily applicable to fundamental reality. He then moves on to his main argument, where he intends to demonstrate that free will is supernatural and that the God of the Bible is the best explanation for its existence.
All right, so the first premise goes like this. If naturalism is true, human nature does not include an immaterial soul. Premise 2. If human nature does not include an immaterial soul, then humans do not possess libertarian freedom. 3. If humans do not possess libertarian freedom, then humans do not possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. So that was the first premise of the last argument. Now it's number 3, and so this is what I call the core of the argument. So then premise 4 is humans do possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. So now we've got some deductive conclusions here. So 5 says, therefore, humans possess libertarian freedom. 6, therefore, human nature includes an immaterial soul. And 7, therefore, naturalism is false. And then 8, the best explanation of human libertarian freedom and the soul is the biblical view of God.
As should be obvious, this argument rests on the prior preliminary argument, which argued that the ability to reason necessarily proves libertarian freedom. Without that conclusion, there is no force to his argument, but that isn't his only problem. His additional premises are also naive and unpersuasive. As he went on to state in the video, the argument is structurally sound in that it follows the rules for a valid syllogism, and we'll grant him that. But equally important are the truth of the premises in order for the argument to be sound. And that's where the problem lies. We will now follow his defense of these premises one at a time.
Premise 1 is synonymous with, if naturalism is true, nature is all that exists. Now, that's true by definition, if you remember. So the first premise is simply synonymous with, if naturalism is true, nature is all that exists.
It's true that naturalism precludes an immaterial soul, but if he had succeeded in refuting naturalism, that would in no way support the existence of a soul. We have alternate possibilities, as I stated earlier, that could explain consciousness within physical reality. In the 21st century, it is well established that the fundamental state of nature defies rational explanation and deterministic causality, a realization that will undermine his argument and add one more example of his naivety earlier foreshadowed by his physics and chemistry. He simply has no grasp of physics, which underlies the whole deterministic versus indeterminacy issue at the base of the question of free will. He repeats this same error in premise 2.
Premise 2 is tantamount to the following. If all that exists is nature, then everything about humanity is causally determined by forces and events outside of human control.
He adds needless and obfuscatory confusion by modifying soul with immaterial. Again, a basic knowledge of physics might have been useful here. First, at the fundamental level of reality, there is no material, only energy. In fact, what we perceive as matter is really just an incredibly complex interplay of quantum fields, one of which must be the Higgs field in order for matter to occur. In reality, the universe is immaterial but physical as wave energy. This is where quantum reality comes into play. Some leading physicists and neuroscientists, such as Penrose and Hameroff, are engaged in a serious exploration of quantum mind theory, which is the first plausible, fully physical explanation of consciousness. It eliminates the misleading metaphysical supposition of substances and suggests the possibility of free will. It starts from the fact that we are quantum beings entangled in a quantum universe. Being such, our entanglement could be the first step of consciousness, and operating at the indeterminate quantum level escapes the problem of determinacy, thus enabling free will. While this theory is in its infancy, it has the advantage of not relying on unknowable metaphysical assertions. The important point is his assertion that without an immaterial soul, we cannot have free will is groundless and contradicted by quantum physics. Quantum entanglement could fill the gap, which will eliminate immaterial soul as an explanation. And in premise 3, we find that Stratton is equally unaware of contemporary neuroscience. This will be an extended clip of his presentation because this premise really centers on the crux of the matter.
So, premise 3, usually the first to be attacked, it communicates the following, that if something outside of human control causally determines you to affirm a false belief, then it would be impossible for you to infer or affirm a better or true belief. Think about that.
So I only have one option for what I believe. And that belief, that option that I'm going to end up holding is caused by something other than me making a decision or me evaluating evidence. It's just caused by like a ball rolling down a hill type of events.
Right. So, I mean, that's to say, if all things are causally determined by something other than humanity, then that includes all the thoughts and beliefs held by humanity. So really, this is a huge problem.
Yeah. So it's like we believe things, but we don't actually know anything. And we hold opinions, but we had no control over how we got the opinion. We have no control over what opinion we're holding. And what seems or feels intuitively, and I would argue it really is, like we're evaluating evidence and considering and using reason, is really just chemical, inevitable, unstoppable processes that are taking place due to external factors. And therefore, an atheist who says, like, I read the Bible and I think that God is malicious. Like, this is the Richard Dawkins version, right?
Yeah.
You would say, well, but you didn't arrive to that conclusion on your worldview. You didn't arrive to that conclusion through rational thinking. The dominoes fell, and that's where they landed.
Yeah, physics and chemistry fizzed and popped and caused Richard Dawkins to be an atheist. Mm-hmm. And physics and chemistry, according to this view, fizzed and popped and caused you to be a biblical thinker.
Stratton seems to assume that our choices and decisions are either conscious internal acts if we have free will, and thus driven by our own agency, or externally driven. Neuroscientific evidence suggests neither scenario. It is with this premise that the most important issues arise. Much modern research stems from the experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, where he used external electrodes to measure the time between brain activity and the moment the subject became aware of making a decision to move a finger. The result showed about a half of a second lag between the brain activity and the perceived conscious decision. The experiment was criticized on several fronts, most importantly, the lack of timing accuracy provided by the external electrodes and little to no understanding of what took place in that half of a second. These experiments, however, were greatly refined with the advent of fMRI, which not only gave immediate results, but mapped the parts of the brain involved. The lag between decision and consciousness of making a decision has persisted in the refined experiments, and some recent experiments have even shown the apparent ability to predict a subject's decision before the subject is even aware of his choice and acts. Some have seen this as evidence of determinism, but the question isn't really so easily resolved. It's still an open question. What does become apparent, though, is that Stratton's simplistic concept of free will doesn't correspond with the actual processes that take place. What we find is that most decision-making is preconscious and emergent from many factors. The simplistic dichotomy of external causation versus individual agency is false. And as usually the case with metaphysical issues that never resolve, it asks the wrong questions. Purely internal causation can also be deterministic. It turns out there is actually a continuum of action stretching from neural reflex to sophisticated analysis that involves more involvement of the cerebral cortex. But all of these actions have a preconscious component. If we put aside the question of external determination to focus on internal agency, we still see nothing like a purely logical decision process, or one even under conscious control. Rather, we preconsciously undergo a confluence and conflict of emotions and desires, including libido, conscience, empathy, etc., through which some process not yet understood in action results. Only after the decision is made do we become conscious of the decision, if we can even call it that, and experience the illusion of choice at that moment. But really, the decision existed before it entered the conscious mind. In everyday life, we feel our way through the world, which we sometimes later rationalize to justify. But reason is not the way we primarily respond to the outside world. This isn't a new insight. As philosophers as divergent as Hume and Burke theorized this a couple centuries ago. This doesn't answer the question of free will, a question that depends on whether the mind is quantum and a rethinking of what free will would even be. Again, that question rests on whether determinacy or indeterminacy holds sway. But it absolutely precludes the assumption of premise 3 that we rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims in decision-making. Scientific reasoning and future planning are further along the spectrum toward cerebral cortex involvement, but are not the usual mode of decision-making and are still largely influenced preconsciously. Everyday decisions, including moral judgments, are much further toward the preconscious end of workings of conflicting sensibilities and less cerebral determination. In the video, Winger and Stratton derisively dismissed the possibility of free will being an illusion, but the preponderance of scientific evidence suggests it is. They have often carelessly dismissed the suggestion that their experience is an illusion. Certainly, the Earth doesn't orbit the sun, since I can't feel it move under my feet, and I obviously see the night sky move across. It turns out that very basic certainties, such as space-time and causality, are to a great extent illusory. Simple derisive dismissal is only a sign of ignorance. Stratton then takes a turn toward justification of our beliefs, which is a bit removed from the question of free will. It is really a continuation of his confusion in premise 3 between an epistemological question of inferring truth and the practical question of decision-making.
So this really comes down to justification for our beliefs. So the atheist, if naturalistic determinism is correct, as we've seen, we don't have justification for any of our beliefs on this view. Now, to make matters worse, if justification is required for knowledge, or at least some kinds of knowledge, then this knowledge becomes an illusion. This knowledge is illusory. Like you said, we don't know anything. So atheists are saying that free will is an illusion, and I'm saying, okay, great. Well, if that's the case, then rationality and knowledge gained via the use of reason or the process of rationality are also illusions. That knowledge gained through rationality is also an illusion.
Here, Stratton fails to make any point at all. He claims the view that reason produces illusion is self-evidently false, ignoring the large body of contemporary neuroscience and epistemology that suggests it just might be illusory, or at best an extreme reduction. Stratton and Winger merely repeat here the same error they made when justifying free will as self-evident. They once again resort to the tired and false argument that if we claim science based on reason as an illusion, then there's no justification for naturalist claims, which also again tacitly conflates atheism with naturalism. Of course, it could just turn out to be illusion. He then goes into a confused examination of the epistemology involved and makes an unfortunate inclusion of Plantinga's redefinition of properly basic beliefs, which only further blurs the picture.
So let's talk about justification. Epistemologists are professional philosophers who study knowledge and how we gain knowledge and what it means to have knowledge. And so these epistemologists often define knowledge in simplest terms as justified true belief. Now, some contend that maybe more might be required, but most, it seems, will say that you need these three ingredients: justified true belief, to have knowledge.
Here he comes perilously close to the fallacy of appeal to authority by exaggerating the status of epistemologists, first by claiming them professional, whatever that might mean, and then simultaneously misstating the principles of some epistemologists and presenting the field as if unified through widespread agreement. To clarify a bit, there is a school of epistemology called Foundationalist Epistemology, against which Plantinga argued because its foundation ruled out the possibility to prove the existence of God. The intention in foundationalism was to avoid infinite regress in justifying assumptions by positing conditions under which an assumption can be presumed basic and true. It in fact did have three criteria, of which at least one must be satisfied to become a properly basic belief. And they definitely were not, as Stratton claimed, justified true belief. The criterion are actually, number one, evident to the senses; number two, a priori axiomatic, such as 1 + 1 = 2, or incorrigible. In other words, to be a properly basic belief, it must be observable or a condition of thought itself. This had the effect, unfortunate for the atheists, of eliminating all purely metaphysical assertions of being, such as a God. Plantinga attempted in his Reformed epistemology to weaken these conditions through his insistence of including traditional carried down beliefs and personal testimony as properly basic beliefs. It's a view that is not accepted anywhere other than among apologists, by the way. I mention this only because Stratton will only confuse this issue further with his introduction of Plantinga's Reformed epistemology. I should also add that foundationalism is far from the only or even dominant view in epistemology.
Knowledge has greater value than mere true belief because it's rationally grounded, right? Imagine that it's tied down to the ground, whereas mere true belief is ungrounded.
This is a distortion of the epistemology in a couple of ways. First, the comparison of properly basic belief is to contingent belief, not to knowledge, as Stratton had attempted to lay out. Knowledge stems both from observation, that is, primary, proper basic belief, and arguments contingent on these beliefs. They do not come into conflict, and Stratton set up a false contradiction. Second, as we have already seen, it is very debatable that knowledge can be grounded in reason, and much of contemporary philosophy grounds knowledge instead in experience. Foundational epistemology, for example, grounds it in observed events, experience, or our a priori conditions of experience. Stratton next alludes to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Now, what about those who would say to you, but Tim, evolution has caused us to arrive at the state we're at now, and in evolution, it's survival and reproduction are the main things. And I think that rational thinking would aid survival and increase the likelihood that you'll produce offspring. And then, what would your response to that be?
Yeah, well, this gets us back to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that argument's pretty good because what it does is it shows that our beliefs on evolutionary naturalism, that these beliefs are not aimed at truth, they're aimed at survival.
Right.
And so you've got to, this kind of undercuts your ability to know things once you realize that your beliefs are aimed at truth. However, one could counter that and say, yeah, but given survival, it seems that we would survive better if we were having true beliefs.
Here he centers on the unsound argument that if evolution was guided by survival rather than truth, then naturalism lacks the tools to know that. First, that in no way supports his claim that reason did evolve to find truth. Second, the aim of reason to be other than truth, in fact, can be demonstrated through experience, such as awareness of where reason breaks down in the face of recalcitrant experienced reality, and observance of the mechanism of reason within neuroscience. Anil Sith and Donald Hoffman, among other leading philosophers and neuroscientists, show how reason reduces incomprehensibly complex reality that surrounds us to grossly simplified icons which we can then manipulate. Rather than planting his claim that a true grasp of reality through reason would aid our survival, it becomes apparent that the complexity would overwhelm and freeze us into inaction. Hoffman compares this to icons on a computer graphic interface, only through which the incomprehensible stream of ones and zeros becomes usable, but not in themselves anything real. Our forebears evolved reason while fighting for survival on the savannah. They were able to manipulate their environment to escape predators and catch prey through simplifying the world down to those representations which were necessary to plan and act. True grasp of nature was not the purpose, but mere practicality was. But this also does not imply that understanding is completely false, or it would have no adaptive value at all. The point is, it reduces and approximates the environment for practical purposes, not revelation of underlying truth. It should come as no surprise that rational systems of understanding always break down when more complexity is introduced, as we have seen in both relativity and quantum physics. Science itself is an outgrowth of this gross simplification into icons, as shown in its current struggle to explain complexity beyond our grasp. Now it's Winger's turn to make an invalid point.
Bottom line is that what the naturalist is affirming on one hand is evolution is aimed at reproduction. Right. That's it's not even actually survival exactly. It's reproduction. That's the thing.
Surviving so you can reproduce.
Yeah, it's all just which is why something that dies while reproducing is an evolutionary win. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's aimed at reproduction. And so to say, I'm gonna stretch being aimed at reproduction to being aimed at forming thoughtful, rational, philosophical beliefs is just. It's just not really warranted. That's a big jump.
Here he merely attempts to affirm the Plantinga-Stratton argument through empty assertion that the claim jumped from reason aimed at reproduction was then somehow stretched to forming rational philosophical beliefs is too big a leap to make. Again, just like realizing that the Earth actually does orbit the Sun was once just too big a leap to make. But in the end, the evidence supports those stretches, and Winger's facile dismissal only exposes his own shallow grasp of the issue. And this brings us finally to Stratton's last premise, that humans do possess the ability to infer and affirm knowledge.
We've got to possess the ability to rationally infer and affirm claims of knowledge. And we know this because to argue otherwise would be to affirm it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it is another repetition of the false argument that we are not able to recognize the limitation of reason from within reason. In fact, science never claims reason is totally false. It does have approximate correspondence to reality, but only as a gross simplification within limited parameters for practical purpose. It's also necessary to point out that the only impetus to his claim would be to discredit naturalism, not to establish free will. To bring us back to the central point I made at the beginning, the question of free will is not one of naturalism versus theism, or the supernatural, but causal determinism versus some degree of indeterminacy. The issue of naturalism is a red herring which, and despite his earlier disclaimer, he's using simply to imply that free will disproves atheism. Of course, it does no such thing. Stratton next takes us on a journey back to high school math class to give us an analogy that actually undermines his point.
Let's put justification in terms that many might relate to. If you've ever had a math class, think about being back in high school, taking a math class, and the teacher gives the students a multiple choice quiz of one complex story problem. The teacher wants to see if his students know how to solve the story problem. So the first student was like me in high school and didn't understand the problem at all. But I did a lot of guessing in high school, and so even though the first student doesn't understand the story problem whatsoever, it's a multiple choice quiz. And so he guesses and he circles C, right? Well, guess what?
C was always my go-to.
That's right. It's got to be your go-to. and guess what? It worked. C happened to be correct. Now he circles the correct answer on the paper, but does this student know the answer?
Mm-mm.
Does he possess knowledge?
No.
Of course not. All right, so let's go to the next student. The next student doesn't understand the problem either, but he knows his neighbor to the right. She's pretty smart, so he cheats, right? We don't recommend that, but he's cheating. He's looking on his neighbor's paper. He sees that she circled C, so he's like, all right, I'm going to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Circled C. Well, guess what? The answer is correct. But does he know the answer?
No.
No, he doesn't possess knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, finally, let's talk about this last student. She understands the story problem just fine, but she goes further. She shows her work in the margins, right? She's cranking out all the numbers and showing how it works, showing her work leading to the correct answer. And she circles C. Does she possess knowledge?
Yeah.
Of course she does. The fact that she showed her work is the tether that demonstrates to her teacher and to herself that she possesses knowledge of reality.
This is where Stratton's confusion of knowledge with practical reason, that is epistemology with decision-making, will become a serious problem. First of all, his analogy focuses on what constitutes knowledge, not on what enables free will, although he will try to fudge that gap later. More importantly, it doesn't even support his claim of knowledge of reality. If we compare students 2 and 3, we will see their actions and knowledge were not essentially different as concerns reality. Student 2 received his information for the correct answer from an external source. It didn't tell him the reality of the correct answer or anything about the world at large. The answer could have been wrong. The point here is his action was externally derived from his internal inclination to trust the source. But what about student 3? Her decision to choose answer C was also externally derived, presumably by the words of her teacher and the math textbook, and internally from her inclination to trust those sources. Her working of the problem was only a more intricate performance of the same type as student 2. As for knowledge of reality, what if this class was on Euclidean geometry, which posits that parallel lines can never meet? Did it tell her anything true about the world? We know that if we expand the frame of reference to the scale of relativity, then parallel lines will necessarily meet, and her externally derived answer does not tell us about reality. It is based on too small a frame of reference as assumed in the narrow band of reality described by Newtonian physics, within which reason itself evolved and to which it adapted. To come closer to reality, we would need Riemannian geometry. In both 2 and 3, no free will is demonstrated, but rather 2 examples of decisions caused by external forces, neither of them having anything to do with knowledge of reality. As Stratton clearly stated at the beginning, his argument is structurally correct, but unsound if the premises are false. As I have shown, the premises are naively false, relieving us of the burden of examining his unsupported conclusions. Again, I have not tried to disprove free will. On the contrary, I lean toward the view that quantum mind theory, along with the rethinking of what free will would be, just might establish it. Rather, I have shown that the typical theist attempt to establish God on the basis of free will fails due to false premises based on obsolete medieval metaphysical assumptions and are not to be taken seriously. I necessarily reduced a long, rambling, and repetitious video to these few clips, which I feel suffice to fairly present their argument. If either Winger or Stratton disagree, I welcome them to come on to discuss and make their case. This invitation also extends to any other competent respondent.